Welcome back, my great teens. I hope you are fine. I hope you are rested momentarily, but I hope you are ready to engage in our little online lesson. Just a quick discussion. I will be present on each slide, but not visually. I will be explaining on the slide itself with my voice. So if you have any reference, just keep listening. All the information will be discussed. If you have a question, ask it on the group. I will be happy to reply, but the main focus is to listen to each slide discussion in the audio. If you have connection problems, please let me know. I'll just recap the signal. And that's pretty much all. I hope you enjoy the lesson. Focus. Think clearly. It is really not that complicated. At the end of this lesson, there will be a task and there will be a small assessment just to check who's still here, who has survived the lesson, and who has gone missing. I am certain some people will try their luck, but please don't. This will be recorded and your presence will be recorded. I'm sorry. You may have a little revolution of your own towards me, that is fine. But at the end of the lesson, you will need to do a diary entry where you place yourself in the era of the French Revolution and reflect on what you see, what you hear, and what is the surrounding environment. So I hope you listen in the lesson to help you with your assessment at the end. Good luck. Morning, my great teens. Welcome back to what we call a recorded lesson. I hope you are ready. You had your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, whatever you may need to endure what I call an online lesson. Now, as you can see, we're dealing with our dear Frenchman, but today we are going to discuss the French Revolution. Now, quick background. The French Revolution marked an important chapter in the birth of the world we know today. For instance, the political structure we have today comes from the French Revolution. We don't have a king, we have a selected leader. This signifies the collapse of the old ways, the old empires, the old means of government. Can we imagine we have a king of the classroom or queen of the classroom? There will be a few revolutions in that case. And everybody today is not judged by how much money they make, but according to who they are. Today, people don't really care if you're rich or you're poor, except in some cases, in some countries. But in this country, the only thing that matters is what can you do? Do I know you or don't I know you? And with that said, let us start our wonderful lesson. I would ask you to please carefully listen to my voice as I guide you through this wilderness of revolutions. And so, my great teens, we are at the point where we have to ask ourselves, what is revolution? How do we define revolution? Is revolution a child suddenly stop eating candy and starts eating vegetables? Is it learners that suddenly put down their phones and start studying? No. Revolution, and I want you to take very careful note to what I'm about to say. Revolution is a sudden, unexpected, and forced change that causes a turnaround economically and politically. So first of all, it's not one person, it's not two people. It is a mass amount of people that shares the same insecurities, the same suffering, the same problems, but most of all, my great teens, they share the same enemy. And in this case, the enemy is the hierarchy, the king, the nobles, the corrupt church, the corrupt bank. These are the enemies of the lower class people. because they view that these higher classes are responsible for their suffering, and they actually were, as I'm going to show you later. But we can divide all these problems and crises and illness and violence in a few sections, which I'm going to show you now. But pay attention on these three tabs available on the slideshow. These are the main factors, the main aspects that I want to see in your analysis when we talk about what is a revolution. And my grade 10s, here we have our classes. We have our political, social and economic factors that led to the revolution. We are going to pay close attention to each of these factors, especially where the climax was, how did it happen, and who is responsible for it. When we look at the political factors, we look at the relationship between the hierarchy.
Nighty-night. That's going to be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's going to be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's going to be a lot of responsibility. Oh, great.
Okay, my grade teens, with that dramatic yet exciting entry, I would like you to notice the following. Firstly, the king was still in the beginning. He was still learning how to rule. He was still unable to rule on his own. He was a victim of his position. He was responsible for making most of the mistakes because of this weak mindset he had. Although he had a lot of power, he didn't have his self-assurance. He didn't have his self-strength. He didn't act as king. He was seen as a boy on a king's throne. Everybody found very easily to get what they wanted out of him because of his power. He had power, but he was unable to independently use this power. As we can see, he had absolute power. He was more like a dictator, but he didn't make his own decisions. He was forced to make those decisions to keep everyone happy and avoid confrontations. He was responsible. He was responsible for signing the high taxation. He was responsible for giving out power to corrupt officials, corrupt landowners, and he appointed the high positions in the church, which also was corrupt. They called it the holy tax, but it was actually tax to decorate and enrich the church positions, the owners, the bishops themselves. So all in all, he was considered a weak leader. He was mocked. He was criticized. And this even fueled him to become even weaker. As a king, he had a weak personality. It was completely the opposite, as we can see in this picture. He was viewed as a king, but he did not have the critical values or mindset to be a king. I mentioned that he was a boy on a king's throne. The royal expenditure, the amount of gold and silver they spent, was mostly because of the queen. He could not say no for her expenditure. She couldn't stop spending, and he never stopped her. Why? Because he didn't have the self-value, the self-empowerment, the self-stance to say no. Everything was done for him his whole life as a prince, and suddenly he had to do everything as a new king. And this aspect really was key in allowing the revolution to take place. Okay, now let's study the social structure where he was at the top. And so, my great teens, we come to the point where we can study this great triangle where we use the population in comparison to the power. As we can see at the very tip top, we have the royalists and the high-ranking nobles. They are only 2% of the total population, but they possess the most power, the most authority, and have the most ownership. When we look at the second level, the middle level, we are not talking middle class. We are still talking about nobility, landowners, bank owners, individuals of high positions in churches. We have no middle class. This is very important. We have no middle class. We have a large gap between rich and poor. And especially look at these second level nobility. They are only still 18%. 18% of the total population, which has accumulation of the authority to make decisions about taxation, land, and overall power over the poverty. Now, most important, look at the lower poor level. 80% of the population with almost 0% power. This indicates literally a 1 to 25 balance of power. That is the amount of destabilized power we can see in this triangle. And this is what the revolution was about, to actually break down this triangle and make it more balanced, to start and create a middle class and a balanced upper class. Let's look at the next slide. And here we can clearly see the effects of this great triangle. As you can see, we have the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The three divided sections, and they are colored according to how much people were part of that estate. But I want you to pay carefully attention to this picture on the right. We have the kings. We have the church, we have the nobility. All of them are riding on this man that is weak, shackled, blinded, and naked. This man is the poor population. He is shackled to them. He endures their weight. He endures their abuse, and he cannot see. He is blinded. He cannot go into any direction where he knows this is where I'm going. It is because these three classes, all of them, are literally controlling him blindly. They are leading him in circles, and he is suffering. He is literally buckling under the weight, as you can see at the bottom. He is barely coping with his very existence. Quickly take a look as we advance to the next slide.
To try to get revenge on the British by financing their American colony's revolution. Hey, we're an independent nation now. That was real swell of you, Louis. Couldn't have done it without you. Glad I could help. So hey, about all that money we lent you, when can we get that back? Yep, you're a great guy. I'll never forget what you've done for us. Real glad I could help, friend, but about that money, gotta go now, chum. Best of luck to you. Oh, no. And now France was in even more debt. France.
And so, my great teens, I hope the previous video helped you to understand the amount of national pride, the amount of ridiculous spending led to even a deeper state of debt in France. And now, despite everything, France aids the American Revolution, leading to complete financial collapse. Continuous government expenditure caused that the lower classes had to even work harder and harder to accumulate enough money to sustain this ridiculous amount of expenditure. This caused stagnant economic growth. The economy didn't increase. It didn't even expand. It was a sitting duck. It was sitting in debt, not moving anywhere. Starvation, illness, job loss, and stagnation in industry started to appear. The 7 Years' War was a challenge to the French pride. The War of Independence was a response to regain pride, but pride wasn't the cost of the war. The cost of the war was the suffering and working continuous labor of the lower classes, as we would surely see, and they accepted it. They needed a sense of awakening, but the economic pressure and suffering was one of the main contributing factors to the French Revolution, and we are going to explore that in the next slide.
Already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves being taxed from every direction. Hey, I'm the royal tax collector. Looks like you've yet to pay your income tax, head tax. By the way, how many windows you got in that house of yours? 3? Oof, yep. There's gonna be a tax for that. Hey, your local priest here. Have you paid your church tithe yet? Well, at least this one is going to the good work of God. Sure. God. I think this year, God wants me to buy a new swimming pool. Hey, private tax collector here. Oh, and I brought some goons with me. Just a few quick questions. How much salt did you buy this year? About 7 kilos, I think? Yep. Okay, there's gonna be a tax for that. Oh, what's that over there? And that's extra salt I held over from last year, so I wouldn't have to buy as much this year. Oh, yep, there's a tax for that. And what are you doing with all this salt? Well, obviously cooking. On the table. Yep. And preserving fish and meat. Oh no. Yep, and there's a tax for that. Hey, how old is he? He's 9. And so he's purchased his required amount of salt for this year, right? What? No, he's 9. Uh-oh. Sorry, little Timmy. Looks like I'm gonna have to tax you for that. Yep, salty. There's gonna be a tax for that. And that's not all. A huge portion of the peasants' harvest had to be given up. And there was also the labor tax, where peasants were required to work a certain number of days for their local lord without pay. Obviously, people weren't too happy with these taxation policies, and the aggressive nature of these private tax farmers sometimes even escalated to violence. In particular though, the people really hated how inconsistent the taxation rules were across the nation, and also the fact that the first 2 estates often had to pay very little, if any tax at all. And so, the anger continued to grow. France had a population that was just about ready to explode. What could push them over the edge? How about a touch of natural disaster? A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvests in ruin. meaning they had no food or money, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so they were virtually untouched by this new crisis. But now the poor really were starving, and they began to riot. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged. Wow, this is really getting out of control.
And here, my great teens, is a fine example of a great summary that I have prepared for you. Hope you like it. This focus on what caused the idea of a revolution, a very important thing you must consider. And most of it focuses around poverty and the privileges of the higher class. We can see the nobility didn't pay any tax, or even if they knew what was tax. The poor paid everything. They had to make up for all the rich class expenditures, the wars, the failing industry. Poverty were not paid for their services, yes. The lower classes were not paid for any labor, any job, or any activity. It was demanded of them, and if they did not complete their job, they were arrested, or they were fined, or they were even taxed. Royal expenses were increasing. Yes, the new queen, Maria Antoinette, couldn't stop buying new dresses, building a bigger palace. The nobility increased their image, their sense of pride with buying expensive items, building expensive buildings out of special rock or at special places. And the lower level societies couldn't barely keep their houses together. They were surviving on what they have. And this created a lot of anger towards the nobility, who just carried on as if there was nothing wrong. Meanwhile, the majority of the population was suffering. They were suffering increasing illnesses. They were starving. They were ill-treated. And this started to take a great effect on the lower classes in terms of their resentment towards the higher classes, which they saw was responsible for this circumstance, for this life they lived. And it is important that you take into consideration that if you are not paid for the jobs you do, how can you afford food? How can you afford medicine? How can you increase your living standards? How can you improve it? The answer is you are stuck. You can't. You are placed in a position where you cannot move to another position. You are stuck as poor as possible. And it's important that you consider that. It was pay in their instance, as you can see in the previous video. And this is a summary of the most important factors you must consider. And in the next slide, we are going to analyze the knowledge aspect. Who contributed to a broader based thinking? And the answer was the philosophers. And this is what we are going to discuss next. Okay. Now I want to ask you a question. Because of your age, you will maybe understand this serious question. But what happens when someone angry, someone really upset, takes a phone and is capable of doing anything? What do you think they are capable of? Let us just call it social bullying, propaganda, lying, manipulation, morale supporting, influence. There's a whole list. So just to sum it up, let's just say that someone angry with a phone is called dangerous. But mostly during this period of 1775, we do not have phones. But what is dangerous in this period is a man with a paintbrush or a man with a pencil. They can write or design anything that critiques anything. And what better subject to criticize than the French royalty, the French nobility, and questioning their logic, questioning their wisdom, questioning why. Why do we need a king? Why do we need a queen? Isn't any man's house his castle? Isn't every man created equal? We have heard that a lot. And here is where it begins. Here is where the root started. And we call this the age of enlightenment, the age of questioning the purpose of everything, questioning the purpose of how the economy is being run, questioning the capabilities of government, questioning everything. And it was the philosophers that were the instruments of propaganda, the instruments of manipulation, the instruments that made people realize what actually was going on, because people just accepted how they were living. But these philosophers woke them up. They said, listen, here's a pill. On the pill, it stands, wake up, drink it, and you'll see things differently. And they did. They observed how they were treated, what they can do, what they are capable of, and combining this with starvation and desperation, we can clearly see, great teens, that there is a lot of dangerous energy being developed, and it's focused on this system, this hierarchy, this king and his expensive queen, and it is starting to, let's just say, accumulate a lot of pressure, a lot of need for change. And as we look at this, these are the unique individuals that ask, do you really have to pay this? Why is this so? Do you think about this? Do you really believe this? What is the truth? Those questions are the iconic questions that are starting to appear, and the social level are starting to realize how ridiculous this system is. They do not have to crawl on their limbs and carry the second state and the first state anymore. They are France. They are the system. They are the economy. They are everything. The nobility needs them. They don't need the nobility. A very, very dangerous development, don't you think? A very, very dangerous method of thinking. And it is here where the most iconic slogan develops. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. It means freedom, people, and ground. It means everything belongs to the people who works with it, who deserves it, who have striven for it. Every people have their freedom, their place of belonging, and their right. And here is where the equality of humankind starts to develop. It is these philosophers. Now, here are just a few examples for you. Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Very difficult French names, but it is just an example for you to go and study if you want to. Their personal effects in society. But these men, you can see even in the pictures, that they are not the lowest of the low. They are somewhere in the upper low class of society. So they were intellectuals. They were capable of reading, writing, expanding art to illustrate what was going on. And they were like a bridge between the upper class and the lower class. So in a sense, they were the middle class, but still poor in their own sense. Some of them were upper class and started to realize the necessity, the broader based thinking. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what became the dangerous moment in the French Revolution, is when people start thinking differently.
All just accepted it for centuries. Why? Why what? Why do the nobility get to be all rich and stuff? Just because they were born into it? And the rest of us schmucks just have to accept that? Hell, why do we even need a king? Who decided that? It all just seems very unfair and unequal, and I, for one, am starting to question it. Wow, that's very enlightened of you.
And here I have gathered a few versions of the slogan for you. Because the slogan is very important. It is not just a sentence. It is not just a saying. It becomes the very heart, the very idea of the revolution. What the people are striving for, what they want, what they need, what they are trying to protect or expand in their view. Look at the pictures. Look at them. The slogan is being glorified, it's being colored, it's being honored in a sense. It shows how important the slogan was to the people. It's even wrapped around the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower being a symbol of the bankruptcy. It was a gift from the American Revolution. But in return, the Statue of Liberty was built after the American Revolution as a symbol. So both are actually symbols, but maybe the slogan is wrapping around the past, almost constraining it, covering it. And if we look at the bottom picture, it is covered in the national flag. It has become just as important as the national flag. The idea of the revolution, the literal essence of the revolution, is part of the nationality itself. Remember this if I give you a national flag and ask you its relevance to the slogan, or and here is the last straw, the last chance for nobility to save France from the impending changes. And this last moment before the revolution was called the formation of a State General, where all representatives from all three estates would attend this grand meeting. But the king knew that he needed some kind of voting system. He wanted to know that everyone has a say in the development of France. But in the way it was constructed, it was not liable. One vote was given to each estate. The first got one vote, the second got one vote, and the third estate, the poor estate, got one vote. But the nobility always supported each other to stay rich, to stay empowered, to stay in placement, to keep their lifestyle, as you would say. And what happened as a result is the third estate, the majority of the people, the poor people, the starving people, were always losing these votes because of the 2-to-1 notion. But landowners and common nobility did not stop there. They taxed any third estate individual that wanted to attend these meetings, that wanted to vote, so they can decrease the amount of people that speeched, that spread ideas, such as the philosophers. They taxed these individuals to attend these meetings and to stop them from attending. And as a result, as you can see in this diagram, it was actually still unequal. It was still not liable, and this was the final failure that the king did not realize. But what do we learn out of this idea of revolution? What do we see in revolution itself? We said change, we said ambition, we said something new. But what does it mean for us? We said the French Revolution created many things we know today. No king, no absolute power, but this applies to what we know as democracy, what we know as every person has a right, every person has a vote, not every group of people have a vote. We are empowered politically. Anyone can become a political official. We don't have to be born to have a say. We don't have to be born noble to have any influence. We can have influence. Today, you can build your power. You do not have to be born to have power. But also we learn the concept of mistakes, how to identify corruption, how to identify what it leads to, how to identify the cause and consequence sense out of the revolution, and we learn also the importance of finance, how to manage it, how to implement it, who is responsible for the finance, and we learn to respect people as they are. We do not oppress because people have less. We do not control when we have no right to control. We learn a lot out of the French Revolution and its consequence. We learn the danger of desperation. We learn the danger of anger. We learn the danger of oppressment. We learn all these things, but what does it accumulate to? We learn the effects of weak leadership. Leadership that are blind, leadership that only pleases itself, and leadership that lacks control where it matters most. And now we can recap on what we have learned about the French Revolution so far. And I have chosen to personally look you in the eye, well, sort of, as we discuss what is left, what is forgotten, or what you are uncertain about. So, these are the most important aspects you should take into consideration, my great teens, when you are brave enough to pursue what I'm going to call an online quiz very soon. So I'm going to ask you to be brave, be revolutionized, be a rebel. But do not choose the wrong answers. I want you to choose the right answers. Now, do not see that as an oppression, that is a request. So, when we talk about the definition of revolution, remember what I told you. It is a sudden, unexpected, forceful change economically and politically, and there must be a form of resistance. In the French Revolution, we're talking about the nobility, we're talking about the royalists were resistant to the change. We saw that in the general meeting. And the significant events of the revolution are comprised out of 5 key moments. First, it is the depth of the war. Secondly, it was the expenditure of the Queen, Marie Antoinette. Thirdly, it was the natural devastation of the food supply. Fourth was the interpretation of the philosophers, the Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, and fifth was the failure of the General Estate Assembly. Those are the key moments in the French Revolution, from the beginning, the start of the bankruptcy, to the final meeting before the French Revolution. And the political factors, I want you to look at the hierarchy, I want you to look at the taxation, I want you to see the value between the classes and how they were treated, what was their purpose in society, my great hands. Social factors, we have the abuse between classes, we have the new way of enlightenment, the age of reasoning, and most of all, the criticization of the noble classes starting to evolve. The economic factors, we have the war debt, we have the expenditure, we have the bankruptcy, we have the corruption of the churches and the middle class nobility, we have the continuous taxation exploiting the poor, and mostly the poor were not paid for the labor. So for any work they did, they were not completely compensated. And this was the economic decline. Work, no pay, but they were still expected to pay taxes, and it was complete ridiculous taxes. So, with that, we're going to end this lesson and start moving to assessment. If you have any questions, we are still live to explain anything you might know, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give you the answers. So do not try and be the wisdom in this exercise.